Welcome to Through the Eyes of a Maine Guide. Every journey holds a story. By sharing the wisdom of those who came before us, we keep their legacy alive for generations to come. Join me, Brennan Lane, as we explore the wild through the eyes of a Maine Guide. Welcome back to another episode of Through the Eyes of a Maine Guide with your host, Brennan Lane, and today I have Hal Blood with me as a guest. Thanks for coming on, Hal.
Oh, you're welcome. My pleasure.
Today we'll talk about some of the history of guiding in the Jackman region and some of the older gentlemen that Hal had the pleasure to come in touch with and through his journey up here.
Yep. I got some good stories.
Well, that's perfect. That's just what we want to hear. You want to give a little background on yourself for people that listen that don't know?
Well, when we're all teenagers, we're dreaming about what we're going to do, in our life. And mine was always to not get married, live in a log cabin up north. That was about the extent of my thinking back then. So, and then the other thing I was thinking was, well, if I got to get a job, maybe I'll be a game warden because I'll be in the woods all the time. And I ended up going in the service, Marine Corps, and then when I got out, they weren't taking applications, so that dream was dashed. But it was a good thing because I got realizing later when you're a game warden, you might get your time in the woods, but you ain't hunting for yourself.
Yeah.
So anyway, so that kind of led me to thinking back to my plan of somehow figuring out how I could live up north and hunt and fish. And I think the next thing I could think of was guiding. So I said, I'll work towards that. So, but to get there, because we didn't have no money to start any business or anything. And then I ended up, my plan of not getting married was dashed when I met my wife, Deb, just like a month before I went in the Marine Corps. So anyways, we ended up getting married and here we are. So I started, her father was a lobsterman, and he asked me if I wanted to try that. So I said all I could think of was outside work and no time clock. So I started that. I worked for him a couple years, and I learned that business and went on my own. And I told Deb at that time, I said, I'm gonna fish for 10 years. I said, then we're moving north. And she said, yeah, okay, probably thinking that would never happen, So along we went, and I ended up fishing for time I got about to the 8th year. We'd bought the property up here because I was looking for land, and I actually looked in different parts of the state. But to back up a little bit, I got brought up here with my father and his cousins and family when I was 16 fishing. And that's my first trip to Jackman when I was 16. So then we came the next couple of years, then I went in the Marine Corps. But so when I always remembered that. And then when I started deer hunting after I got out of the Marine Corps, I worked for Hannaford's, and the only week I could get was the first week. And back in those days, there was more deer up north here than there was in southern Maine. And there was a 4-week season up north, and it was north of the Canadian Pacific Railroad, which runs right through Jackman. And so I took the only week vacation I could get. Everybody else, all the other guys that had seniority, they got the good vacation pick. So I said, well, I'll go up north. We used to see deer and tracks and everything when we were fishing. So up I headed. And from that first time I came up here, I talked my father into coming up. And from that first year, I just loved the deer hunting up here. And so we had looked for land, and we actually looked in a few different places in the state, but I just kept telling Deb, I said, I'm only going to look around Jackman. I was thinking, it's a good 4-season area for snowmobiling and fishing, hunting, everything. So we started just looking for land, and we looked at a couple things that we weren't interested in, and then I came up fishing. I had my dog, had my lab with me. I had a couple days. It was supposed to be bad weather. I couldn't work outside down there. It was before we were setting traps. Brought the dog, come up, did a little fishing back in the woods, camped out. And it rained hard there. I remember it was probably on Sunday morning or something. I got up and it was raining. I said, I'm just going to head out. When I come back to town, I came up. I said I'd never been. I had extra time. It wasn't like I had to hurry home. And I'd never been down this road here, the Addian Road. And I drove down it, and I knew it went down to the lake, Addian. On the way down, there was this for sale sign out for this piece of land here. And so I looked at it and I go, this looks pretty good. I said, it's got power and it's close to town, but it's gravel road, and secluded kind of. Went back, saw the real estate agent. It had just gone on the market. And I gave him a little bit of money and went home and told her I'd found some land for us. And so we ended up buying it, and that was the beginning of it. But anyways, we decided to build one camp to begin with, and we'd have a place to come to. So we built a duplex, and then I had people, I rented the other side, and I took a couple of deer hunters, and we had some snowmobilers and different things, and I ended up, people were asking me about bear hunting and deer hunting, if I was going to guide for that. I said, yeah, I'm going to do that. So I ended up, I didn't make it to 10 years. I cut it short. I told her in the 9th year, I said, this is my last year of lobster, and we're headed north. That didn't go over too good either. I think she told me she went out on the swing set that night, my son's swing set, and cried half the night before she went to bed or something. Reality was coming true. Oh.
Hey guys, shout out to Northwoods Outdoor Supply, proud sponsor of Through the Eyes of a Maine Guide podcast. If you guys find yourself in Aroostook County and need any ammunition, firearms, fishing supplies, or any outdoor supplies in general, swing in and see what they have. They have a large variety of firearms, ammunition, ice fishing supplies, regular fishing supplies, and just outdoor supplies in general. Stop in and talk to Brandon. If you don't have it, I'm sure he can get it for you. They're located right in the Martin's Plaza next to Martin's and Tractor Supply. So make sure you stop in and show your support and say hi.
Oh, shoot.
We all have them dreams as young fellers that our wives or spouses just go along with just to say because they don't think it's going to become a reality.
Right. But anyway, she was a trooper through it all. So that's how I ended up here. I just liked it. And when I started, I was deer hunting here every year anyway. We were looking for land at other places, but I was still coming up here deer hunting every year. And I started to learn more and more of the places. So it was just a natural place to settle into. And then we ended up moving up in 91. And, then I didn't know a lot of people in town when we were building. I met a few people. I got a guy to do the excavating and stuff like that. I'd met a few people, but, then once you move up, you meet more people. And there was some old guys from town. I was 34 years old when I moved up here. And so then there was the next generation, guys like my father's age. And then there was the ones that were the generation after that. And they were already, probably then when I moved up, they were like 80, And the other group was like 60, around 60. But for some reason I like to go listen to them old guys. Because they would always tell stories and stuff. And I actually started chumming around with one of the guys. His name was Carol Huey. He was probably in his early 60s at the time, but he was quite a woodsman. He was cutting wood back when they were doing it with crosscut saws. cutting pine and stuff, and he had an Uncle Harry, and Harry, that was Harry Huey, was his uncle, and he was telling me stories about his Uncle Harry, and but Carroll trapped a lot. That's how I met him. I actually met Carroll back in the woods. He had a little camp back in the woods where we first hunted, and he saw us there every year, and he'd swing by and check on us, make sure everything was all right, and all of that. And because back then the roads were so bad, it was quite a trip to get in back in where we hunted. It was a couple-hour trip. And sometimes Deb would be hunting by herself. Her and her brother would come together. I'd be down lobstering, and her and her brother would come up and hunt.
Mm-hmm.
And he couldn't believe there was a woman up in there hunting, with her little brother that was 10 years younger, So anyway, Carroll was crafty. I did a lot of stuff with him, and he showed me how to make axe handles. He made them out of maple, and so everybody used ash, but he made maple, and he'd find the right size maple, and he'd cut it with his chainsaw. He'd cut it down, a nice straight one, and he'd cut blocks out of it, probably 2 feet long, maybe 30 inches. And right in the woods, he'd do that, and he'd split them 4 ways and pile them in the truck and take them home. And he had a pattern in his shop for axe handles, and he'd trace that out and cut them down. He'd just take his other axe, and he'd just begin it. He'd get it flat, 2-sided with an axe. It didn't take him long either. Draw the pattern. He had a cardboard pattern up in his rafters. He had a trapper's shack, Put that on there and trace it out with a Sharpie. Start whittling it all out, and then he'd sand it afterwards. And he gave me a couple of axes, like they were common back then, back in the 90s, the old time axes from way back. And I still have them, the ones he gave me. Put a new handle on them and gave them to me. And then we'd do stuff together and go fishing and whatever. And I never got into trapping. I was too busy in the fall with everything, but I never trapped. But he was a funny guy, and it was a shame that he ended up, probably 10 years after we moved up and I knew him, they got in a tragic accident, him and his wife going down river Christmas shopping, going down through the Bingham curves there in a snowstorm, and a log truck was coming up empty, and the trailer broke free and came around and hit his truck. They had a little S10 pickup truck. Him and his wife were in it, single cab, and that thing swatted that truck down over the bank and down to the river. And it killed him probably instantly, and his wife survived it. She's still doing good, and she's in her 80s now. And but it killed him. It was tragic. But anyway, then the other guys I talked to, one of them actually was a guide and one wasn't. That I don't think he does. He never talked about guiding anybody, but so his Uncle Harry, once Carol introduced me to him, or maybe I met him around, and he would have been probably 80 then. He was the oldest guide in town, the oldest practicing guide.
Mm-hmm.
And he was a little short guy, and he loved fishing. And he had a camp back in the woods. He had his own camp back, similar to where Carol's was, same area. And he would take people on the lake in the spring. I don't think he guided back then. At that time, he wasn't guiding deer hunters, although I think he did at times. But he'd take people fly fishing and whatever. And he was I'd go over to his house, and I'd spend a half a day. He'd make a pot of coffee, and I might stay till noontime there. He'd just tell story after story about what it was like here, because he grew up. I think he was probably born around 1910 or something, And what they cut everything by hand, the wood, and it come out with the horses and all of that. And then when he started guiding, he actually owned was called The Last Resort down on the backside of Long Pond. He owned that for a while and took fishermen there down on Long Pond. And he'd show me pictures back when, it was common up here to catch 7 and 8 pound salmon and 4 or 5 pound trout. Brook trout was common.
That's incredible.
And he told me that this was the interesting thing. Some of the stuff he told me that, like now in these watersheds, we have yellow perch. He said the yellow perch came in the 60s, and he believed they came, ice fishermen lugged them up back. That's about when ice fishing as a kind of a sport got kind of popular. Because I remember when I was a kid, all of a sudden we started ice fishing, right? And he thinks people just set their own bait traps, and whatever was in them they brought and used for bait. But he said before then there was no yellow perch. It was smelts in here, and they had them fall fish, chubs, and trout and salmon. And so that's, anyways, he claims that's what, that between that and the other thing he thought, he used to tell me he had that place. He told me that he guided at most every sporting camp in northern Maine. He'd guide at different camps all over the state. And he guided out on the island on Addian, and he said we ruined the fishing there. He kind of like thought they did it because back then the limit on fish was 25.
25 trout?
25 of anything. Yeah.
Really?
You could keep 25 fish. So every sport that came, and they came and spent a lot of time, they all had guides. All the guides, nobody really fished on their own, so the guides took them up and they know how to fish. And they'd go up there's a deep hole up the northern end of the lake, western end actually. It's the deepest part of the lake. It's about 70 feet deep. And they would jig for smelts and hook the smelts on for the sports, and the sports would lower them down and catch trout and salmon. And again, 7, 8 pound salmon, 4 or 5 pound trout, and every sport lugged 25 back every day.
That's crazy.
And they had contests. They'd have contests, and they never thought about how many fish could possibly be in the lake like that, right? He said we ruined it. The fishing up there. So, I mean, there's still trout and salmon, but I haven't heard I've heard of recently, like somebody get a 5 pound trout up there or something, but no big salmon anymore. You might get a 5 pound salmon, but that'd be pretty rare. But yeah, he had all them stories about that. And then, the other thing he told me about, which I thought was interesting. Oh, getting back to guiding. He used to guide L.L. Bean.
Oh, really?
Every year. He guided L.L. Bean. He guided Ted Williams, the baseball player for the Red Sox. He guided Ted Williams, Bud Levitt. He's the one that guided all of those guys when they come up to fish.
Huh.
Yeah.
Didn't L.L. Bean have like a set of camps up here someplace?
Those are over by Eustis.
Over by Eustis.
The L.L. Bean camps are still over there. Yep. L.L. Bean would come, and he had pictures on his wall over in his house of fishing, having L.L. Bean, all them old time pictures, and he had all, he was given books. I mean, he had them guys autographed everything, L.L. Bean, and and history of the Maine hunting shoe, and Ted Williams's books about him, and he had all that stuff in there. I don't know what happened to that when he passed away, but
hopefully it's in a museum someplace.
Yeah, it's not in the museum in town because I've been snooping around there. They got a pretty nice museum here in Jackman and a lot of lumber stuff. It's a really cool museum, but they don't have that there.
No.
Yeah, I'm sure it's in the family. I should actually ask. I'm going to ask his, would be his great niece in town because she ended up getting Harry's camp. When Carol got in the accident, he had 2 camps pretty close to Harry's, and his kids got those two camps, and then one of the other kids got Harry's camp, one of his grandnieces. So
Hmm.
I'm going to ask about that if she knows whatever happened to that stuff, because it was quite a bit of good stuff. And so a little bit more about Harry. The other thing that I was marveled about, because he would just go on and on with this stuff. I should have had a tape recorder, or camera. Didn't have that stuff back then. Didn't think of it. He told me a couple of interesting things. He told me back. He got a job. They would always be looking for people to cut wood, And him and Carol might have told me this. It was Carol or Harry. They was looking for, Great Northern was looking for woodcutters for the season, one season. And they were going to cut pine over in Sabumic. And they showed up over there with, I think he told me they were 4-foot buck saws. That was like their chainsaw, right? They had a 4-foot buck saw. And when they showed up, they went into the clerk to sign on, and the clerk laughed at him, and he said, "What are you going to do with those saws?" He goes, "We're here to cut wood." He goes, "You ain't cutting wood with them saws." And they give them 6-foot saws to cut wood with. The pine was so big. That's what they had to work with, 6-foot saws. And but anyways, that was pretty funny. But Harry told me about one summer they hired him to cruise wood in northern Maine. I think by the way he talked, it would have been probably back in the 30s, maybe. He was young, 30s, maybe 40s. And he spent the summer in the North Maine woods when there was no roads, really. And they dropped him off with a topo map, or topo maps, in a plane in one of the ponds. And I can't remember the pond he told me. He told me the names of the ponds, but it was in the middle of the North Maine woods somewhere. In his pack basket, with food and what he needed, to camp with. And he walked across a big portion of the North Maine woods, cruising for wood all summer. And they would tell him to go. They gave him a map of, where to go.
Yeah.
And he had to figure it out on his maps how to get there. And a lot of it was by the waterways and the ponds. And they'd fly in more food and stuff for him and leave it at a pond. So that's what he did. He leapfrogged. He'd get to a pond, get more supplies, and keep going. And he had a big journal book, and he had to write down what he was seeing for trees, because nobody'd seen it, except from the air. Like if it was pine or spruce, or he got into hardwoods, maple, and the sizes of them. He had to measure them and kind of record, not every tree, but if he went through, he'd have to figure out how many acres he thought it was of maple and yellow birch and pine, and where it was. He'd put it on the map, circle an area. It was this kind of wood. And that was his job for the summer.
Just crazy to think about that and think about how many roads we have nowadays. Like,
yeah.
There ain't no place I don't think up here in Maine ain't walked that.
Yeah. They caught probably ate a lot of fish on his way. Probably could catch him on a bare hook back then.
Probably. I wonder if he had rice with him.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Oh. Yeah, that was pretty interesting stuff there, talking about that. I mean, that whole story he told me, I mean, that was probably like one morning's worth, like 3-4 hours he talked about cruising that wood, the things he saw. There was no moose hardly up north back then. It was all deer. It was full of deer. And there was moose, but not a lot of them. And I don't remember him talking about, I know the old guys talked about, I'm sure he saw caribou, because they claim the caribou kind of left in the 30s. And I'm sure that he saw caribou. But he mainly talked about the size of the wood and that kind of stuff. And like I said, I don't remember what the ponds were to know really exactly kind of what area he took, but I mean, that'd be like a dream job, wouldn't it?
You ain't kidding.
Yeah.
I guarantee you there weren't half the underbrush that there is nowadays. The walking was probably.
No, it was probably like walking through Yellowstone Park or something, with great big trees, And there was something else I was thinking on that same line that he was talking about. But maybe it'll come to me later. But so then the other guy, and again, I don't think he was a guide, but I think it's interesting to talk. It's kind of history of here. Is I didn't know it till I started talking to these guys. They used to be the way the railroad was set up was it was maintained by hand. That railroad was complete. It was called the Canadian Pacific that's what it was named, and it went from Western Canada, probably all the way to British Columbia, to Halifax, Nova Scotia. And Maine is the only place it cuts through because Maine sticks up into Canada, so they somehow got the rights to cut through. And that's all it was built for, was to cut through. But once it cut through, there was an opportunity for commerce on the trains. And to maintain, it was a big job for a lot of people back then, maintaining the railroad. They had a railroad house every 6 miles on the railroad, all the way through the state, probably all the way through Canada too, but in Maine, particularly here. So that railroad house would maintain, there was a crew of, I don't know if it was 3 or 6 guys, I can't remember. They maintained 6 miles. Each house maintained 6 miles. So they're every 6 miles, so they went 3 miles either side of the house. And that was their job, was to maintain that. And they lived there, I think, during the week, and then they went home for the weekends, jumped on the little carts. Probably back then they
Pump jacks.
pumped the cars along and went out. And there was 3 towns, actual towns, between Jackman and Canada back then.
Really?
There was Holub was a town, and then the next one up was Skinner, and the next one up was Lowelltown. So there was 3 towns, and they all had lumber mills, and there was 100 people, probably about 100 people that lived in each town. There was no access except by the train. And a big part of the work is where the Canadians come in, because it's right there. Maganet, Canada's 12 miles from the border. So anyways, they built the lumber mills, and those were all built shortly after, they probably started doing this shortly after the train went through. So the train went through in 1898, they completed it. And then they started building towns and doing that logging, and they could only get the wood because everything back then, they had to twitch it all the way to the mill on them big sleds, probably with the teams of horses and oxen and stuff. So they cut the whole valley, so the railroad runs through the Moose River Valley all the way out through into Canada, and they cut softwood, right? That's all they cut. And then they cut all of that softwood, and then I think around in the late 20s, the Lowelltown and the Skinner mills closed up. They got all the wood they could get, and they couldn't get any more wood, and they closed those up. But the Holub mill, I think probably closed at the time, and then another Canadian years later opened it up again. A guy named Beaudry. There's roads in around there called the Beaudry roads, because it was a Beaudry mill, and it was accessed by train.
Really?
They never had the road into Holub. That road didn't go in there until the 70s, or maybe the 60s, before they connected the road in. There was some road out this way, and then they connected it into Holub.
That's some true Wild West stuff right there.
Yeah, and then Charlie Lumbert and Reggie Griffin, a couple of guys, logging contractors from town, they ended up buying it. and they ran it until all the wood in that area was cut, and then they were trucking wood in, logs in, milling it, and trucking it back out 18 miles. So they ended up figuring that was a losing proposition, I guess, and they split up, and Charlie wanted to just run the mill, and Reggie wanted to just logging contract, so they just each went separate ways with that, and Charlie brought the stuff out and built the mill, and that's how the mill ended up here, and it's still running today. But a lot of history back in there too. So I was going to tell you a couple of funny stories about this other guy that I used to talk with, and his name was Amy LaCour, and he grew up in that town of the closest mill to the border was Lowelltown, and he grew up there, and he was probably same thing. He was probably born around 1910 because he was Harry's age, and he trapped his whole life in that country. But when he was younger, there was hardly any beaver. I learned that too. There wasn't any moose, and there wasn't any beaver because beaver needed small wood, basically, right? Saplings. When they logged, it would grow the wood for the beavers too.
Yeah.
And he told me, he used to say to me, "Thank God for the beaver." He said, "I don't think we'd ever made it without the beaver," because, those guys were going through the Depression and everything, there was no jobs, but they worked in the woods. But he said, "One winter I caught 13 beaver." Like, that was his big winter. He caught 13
beaver.
Yeah, because they ate them, that. But they were worth like $60. One of the president's wives back then had a beaver coat, and all the wealthy women wanted beaver coats, and they was worth $60. Well, $60 was basically 2 months' pay back then for a person.
So that's pretty. You catch 13 in a winter. That's a pretty good paycheck.
Yeah. But he'd always say that. He'd go, "Thank God." He'd look back, "Thank God for the beaver. We'd never made it," he goes. Yeah.
And now we're overrun with them.
Yeah. Tells you how the dynamics of thing changes, through time with different things too. But so he used to, live back. He said when he was a kid, when his mother needed supplies, she would send him to town. He walked to town on the railroad tracks, and that would be probably 15 miles or close to it on the railroad. He'd walk to town with his pack basket, get her supplies at Curion's store. Curion's store in town was right beside the railroad, and walk back with the supplies.
That's crazy.
Yeah. And then he'd trap on the river. They trap the Moose River would freeze over in the winter, and they trapped that too. And then, but he was quite a character. But I'll tell you a story about him. I used to check on him because he was old, and he used to caretake. He looked after the guys that bought the camps on Birch Island and Holub. It was a sporting camp. That was a well-known sporting resort, Birch Island Cabins on Holub. And Holub was actually known for, like, the biggest trout in the state, on average. They used to catch commonly 7 and 8 pound trout in Holub Pond. And so that was a sporting camp there, and they had to get there by train. There was a siding, and the train would stop, and the people they'd take them out to the island by boats, But that got sold off as individual camps, and one of the big ones was a big 2-story plus a pitched roof, like probably an attic space with a steep pitch. And they used to let Amy stay there in the winter because he didn't like his wife. So he'd go out there and he'd spend the summer, and then when about the time the lake was going to freeze, he'd go home, he'd go back to town for a month till it froze, and then he'd go back out and spend the winter. And then when the ice was going to go out, he'd leave again. That's all he could put up with his wife, he said, was a couple of months a year. And, but I used to have my baits for coyotes up on Addian, and I put a couple on Holub too. And, I used to go check on him. Back then, nobody hardly ever went up there. And I used to go every couple of days and look at my baits, cruise around and stuff. This was back in the early 90s, you know. And I go up there, and I'd pull up. When I'd pull up on my snow machine, back then I didn't even have a Tundra. I had my big MXZ.
MXZ?
I had an MXZ, yeah.
I didn't realize they made them back
89, yeah. Yeah, that's when I think I bought the first she was made. It was an 89. Had to have it, had the biggest motor. Had a 521 or something? And, a 587 maybe. But anyways, I'd pull up and he'd come out on the porch, you know, and he'd wave and he'd go in and he'd get the coffee going. He'd make coffee and he'd tell stories. I'd finally say, Amy, I got to get back. You know, it'd be getting late, and I know Deb's wondering where I'm at. But he was just wanting somebody to talk to, you know. And so I got a lot of stories, old time stories from him. I got a million of them too. But one time I went up there, and he opened the door and he come out, and when he opened the door and stepped out, it was like a billow of smoke come out the door, like the place was on fire. I shut the machine off. I said, Amy, you all right? You got a fire? And he goes, something wrong with the wood stove. He goes, I can't get it straightened out. He'd been in there for 3 or 4 days in that smoke.
Really?
Yep. He couldn't figure it out. Well, it was the wood stove was in the, what you call the living room, I guess. And it had one of them metal bestus chimneys, or might have had a regular stovepipe until it got up towards the roof. But I know on the roof side, out through the roof, was a metal bestus. And I went out and looked, and there's no smoke. The fire's going because it's smoky inside, and there's no smoke coming out of the chimney. I said, Amy, you got a ladder? Yeah, I got a ladder here somewhere. And he got his shovel out and he dug down under the snow, and there's a ladder on the ground there off the side of the building. And I put it up there, and it was, like I said, it was back then they built, you know, high ceilings in a lot of them places, but it was like 20 feet up to the eaves. And then the pitch was like a 12 pitch. So I put a ladder up there, and it reached the eaves, and I went up the ladder and I looked, and it's a metal roof. And I goes, Amy, you think you got another ladder? And he goes, yeah, I got another one. It's not as big. And I said, let's get that. And I went back down, and he had another. That was an extension ladder, the big one. He had another one like it was one piece. So I go up the roof. I'm dragging that. I got it under one arm, and I'm going up that ladder, and I get up there, and I lay it on the roof, and I put the foot of it against my ladder. And I said, Amy, can you hang on to the ladder down there? Yeah, I got you. And he's standing down there. He's about 5'2", you know. He's standing down there like that. And I slowly crawled up that ladder, and I got up there, and I could see, I didn't know anything about a metal bestus chimney then. It's got a screw, like a big hose clamp that holds it on. So I crawled back down. I said, Amy, I need a screwdriver. Yeah, I'll get you a screwdriver. He went and got a big screwdriver, crawled back up. I unscrewed that clamp, got that loosened, and I tapped that thing. And that thing weighed about 25 pounds a cap. It was solid creosote in the top of that. And when I pulled that off, it was like a wind tunnel. Smoke started going right up through there. And I said, I found the problem. So I stayed right up there. I think I did anyways. And I chipped that out with that screwdriver. And I got all of it out, and I put it back together and crawled back down. And, He said, thanks for that. He said, I don't know what I was going to do. And I don't, I don't know why, he had a little snow machine. He had a little Elan.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why he didn't just head out. I guess he didn't want to see his wife bad enough to get out of there, I guess, or something.
Whatever it is, so that was bad.
And the funny thing about that, the guy was healthy. And he died a couple years later, and I think that might have had something to do with it, And the guys that had the cabins out there, most of them were from Massachusetts, and they wanted to do something for him, so they they decided to take him to Hawaii. Now, I don't think the guy ever left the state of Maine in his life. Probably never left. He might have not got beyond Skowhegan. And they got him a plane ticket, and they all went, and they took him to Hawaii, and they bought him one of them Hawaiian shirts, and stuff. And all they did was they got a nice place to stay, a hotel with a swimming pool outside, so he could just sit around and just relax, So the guys told me this, because right after that he passed away, and I used to shuttle some of them guys in there in the winter from here, shuttle them up into Holyoke, but they said when they took him out there, and he said he'd be sitting out there around the pool, and he said there was another guy staying there, younger than him, but he was like a retired guy. And he started every day, he'd go out there and start bending Amy's ear about everything he'd done in his life, because he'd ask Amy, and because Amy really hadn't done much but trap beaver and fish and stuff, And the guy said, I've done this and that, done that. And I think Amy was finally, after a few days, getting a little tired of that. So the guy was on another tear about all the stuff he'd done and stuff. He said Amy leaned right into him. He looked him right in the eye, and he said, you ever skin a beaver? And the guy paused for a minute, and he goes, no, I never skun a beaver. And he said, well, you haven't done everything then, because he kept saying he'd done everything, done it all. He says, well, you haven't done it all yet.
All the way in Hawaii.
Yeah, all the way in Hawaii, yeah. So then there's another one of the older guys. Now, he would have been probably Carol's age, that generation. And he grew up in Holyoke Village. He was born in Holyoke Village, before the road was there. And he would have probably been born in the 30s. He was probably born in the 30s. His name was John Biageron. And so he grew up logging from the time he was a kid. But this guy had kind of an entrepreneurial spirit in him, I guess, because where most people would just go cut wood for somebody else or whatever and hire out, he was cutting wood, but then he got his own truck. You know what I mean? He started
branching off.
Back when they first had those, he showed me pictures of his first truck. He called it Big John. He wrote Big John, and he still had it at the he ended up saving his money, and he bought the land in town for the trailer park, and he built the whole trailer park that's in town, and there's got to be, I don't know, there's got to be a place for 100, maybe 50 or 60 trailers, and then he turned it into a campground too.
Oh, really?
Yeah, big deal. I don't know how many acres was, probably 50 acres he bought right in town. And that's when he moved out from Holyoke, and he built that. And that was like his lifetime project, building his trailer park there. And the guy, one of them, them old guys, they could build anything and fix anything because they had to, right?
With nothing.
But anyways, he guided when he cut wood, and he guided too. He never talked too much about fishing guiding. I'm sure he did. He might have guided on the island, for that crew, but he did his own deer hunting guiding. And back then, he's in the valley, because it's a lot of softwood. It was all deer yard in there too, anyways. But he used to have the sports come in, and they had to come in on the train. And he he bought this camp, which I think originally was probably for logging, and it's still there. It's called the High Chaparral Camp. It's into the west. It's in not too far from Holub. And he owned that, and that's where he guided out of. I'm sure he guided probably out of the village too, but he used to make blinds for the guys. He said the woods was so thick, like in the softwood, and he knew where all the deer trails were and the migration trails, obviously, and stuff. And he said some of the places, the good deer hunting places along the rivers, you couldn't see far, so he would cut shooting lanes. He'd build a blind, and then he'd cut not one shooting lane, but shooting lanes down through. So if the guys saw a deer cross one shooting lane, they could get ready for the next one. That's the way he did it.
Yeah.
And I'm sure they shot plenty of deer. And then he said then the guys would say, well, I couldn't get a shot. They'd get by all of the things and they never got a shot. So he got these little bells like you'd put on your dog maybe or something, collar. And he run a string from the blind. He put the bell in the blind and he run a string down and made like a tripwire. So when before the deer got into the opening, it would ding the bell in the blind and the guy could get ready. He was an entrepreneur. He thought of stuff. But anyways, he told me, stories of the deer hunting back then. Back then it was common for the guides to shoot the deer for the sports. I mean, that was kind of like, it wasn't legal, but that was like the way things were done.
Really?
Yeah. Back in the day, they all the guys that guided deer hunters back then, the guide shot most of the deer. And because some of the guys came up just to play cards and drink anyway.
Get away from the wives.
Yeah. So anyways, he told me he shot 5 bucks over 200 one week. Imagine it.
Holy cow.
Yeah. 5 over 200.
That's great. Just matter to kill 5 in 1 week up here now between 10 guys is an accomplishment.
Yeah.
Let alone do it yourself. Holy cow.
Yeah. But he said, all the guys, everybody got a deer and they went out on the railroad. You see them old pictures, of the deer stacked up at the railroad sidings and stuff, Must have happened there because they had to take them out by train.
That's crazy.
Those deer. And I would tie that back about going, between, we just talking about the beaver trapping, and the beaver were worth like, a lot of money, like a month's wage, because they told me back, it was early 1900s, and I think it didn't change much because you got into the Depression and there was no pay either. But from like the turn of the century, the average wage, and I think it was nationally too, was $1 a day. And that's what the woodcutters made. Unless you were like a foreman, or the cook made more. I think the cook made $2.50 a day or something, whatever. And then the next highest paying job was those railroad guys that worked at the railroad. They made $3 a day working on the railroad.
Really?
You know what guides made? $4. Guides' wage was $4 a day.
Really?
So the guides were the high rollers. They was the big money guys.
Yeah.
Yeah. $4 a day. And if you shot a nice buck for your client, it was worth $10 to $15.
It definitely ain't like that today.
Yeah, that was just the way they did things.
That's crazy. I never realized that.
Yeah.
$4 a day.
Yeah. And then another quick story about Carroll. Carroll had bought, he told me in the 60s, I think 63. It was back before the Holub Road went to Holub, so it might have been late 60s, early 70s when they completed that road to Holub, but he bought them camps, and there was an old road, like, again, they were like those wagon roads, how they cut wood. They went in the winter and they built the lumber camps on the streams. And that old road went to that chaparral camp in there in the Gulf I was just telling you about. But it went by Turner Pond. And Carol bought Turner Pond camps. And it's a beautiful little spot in there. It's not a huge pond. It's probably a half a mile or so across, and it's pretty round. And it took so long to get in there, he couldn't take his sports. He said it would take him. He had one of them old 6x trucks, kind of like a military truck, but it was actually a forestry truck, and it had 6 wheels on it, all-wheel drive. And he told me he took the brakes off it because they would just grind them away anyway in the mud, because it was all mud. And it took him, Turn a Pond, like if you went in the Holub Road now, it's 13 miles. And back then, you could drive in the Holub Road, I think about mile 3 is where the road turned off what is now the Holub Road, and it went cross country, but it went right by Turner Pond, and he would take supplies and everything in that way. It was a 6-hour trip, 13 miles.
13 miles.
6 hours just in low range, just grinding along. But he had his hunters flown in. There was a guy from town, I think he had a place on Parlin maybe, but his name was Eddie Comer, and he had a plane, and he flew his guys, and he said he took 12 guys a week, and I don't know if he did the whole 4 weeks or not because of maybe ice later, but anyways, he took 12, and he said they were all from New Jersey, because back then there was no deer when you got out of Maine back in those days. It really wasn't. It was all farm country. There was no woods for deer. That's why there wasn't any in southern Maine either, to speak of. And but anyways, they'd come in, they'd fly him in, and before the season, he'd go over on the back side of the pond in different places, and he'd cut a cedar tree down here and there for feed. And then guys would show up, and he said a few of them would go out and sit a little bit and hunt, shoot a deer. But he said they mainly played cards and drank in camp. But they all left with a deer. 12 deer went out every week with the guys, and he'd bring 12 more guys in. But he told me, and this would have been, like I said, in the 60s. He only owned it for a few years, and then he sold it. But he said if he went in the summer, he liked to go in and spend a little time in the summer and fish. And he said some mornings he'd go out on the porch with his coffee and sit out on the porch of one of the camps. And he said some mornings you might count 100 deer around the pond.
You ever seen that?
No. No.
That's crazy.
But they didn't get hunted. You know what I mean? If he took hunters in there, that was the only hunters anywhere near there, because there was no road.
A lot of it has to do with the habitat too, though. I think
It was all deer yards.
We can't blame it all on the hunters for the.
No. There was no question when they cut all the deer yards is when the deer herd went down here and everywhere else in northern Maine, because that was all. When you get in, you got hardwood ridges, heading in that way, but this whole Moose River Valley is softwood, and then when you get up to what the head of the Moose River is butts up to Canada, and all the water comes this way. There's wide expanses of it up there. It's miles through the softwood along the river. Imagine what that was like for deer yards back in the day. So yeah. And he wasn't lying about it. He told me pretty matter of fact. He told stories, but things like that he wouldn't, it wouldn't be any kind of a lie or anything.
But just talking to a lot of the people though from like back that generation, like up where we're from, there, the deer are a dime a dozen. There's deer everywhere.
Yeah.
You'd sit there, and there's some guys they'll say you used to be able to sit there in your truck and just sit there on one of the old logging roads, and it'd be nothing to see 50, 75 deer a day walk across the migration trail in front of you. And nowadays you're lucky if you see 10 a year.
Yeah. Yeah, it's It's a crazy, but we can't think about how many there was, When I first came up here hunting in the 80s, there was there was a lot of deer, and then there was other places there really wasn't. I can think back when I started hunting back in the east side of the 201, and there was, you could see deer you didn't see deer you didn't like bump into them everywhere, but if you hunted all day, you'd see a few deer. And then, but there was seemed to be more deer back, towards not really town, but west of town for some reason. And Carol Huey actually told me that because it was getting worse and worse in there through the 80s, and I didn't realize it, but that's when they were cutting Canada Falls Lake Deer Yard in the South Branch. They started in what's the Kelly Dam Road now, and they cut all that deer yard the whole length of the South Branch to Canada Falls Lake, and all the way around the back of the lake where it was all deer yard. So the deer were all disappearing, and we noticed it in there. So Carol said, I said, any more deer anywhere else around here? And he said, yeah. He said, go out. He said, there's way more deer on the west side of 201. So that's what I started looking around there, and there were. I remember the first year we went up the lake when I used to do my remote camps up Addy in there. We only went up there for 2 weeks. We went up the last 2 weeks, and I'd hunted, everywhere else, wherever else I was hunted. I'd guided some hunters, and I don't know where I know I saw the most deer when we went up there. But I remember that year I had seen 84 deer that season. Yeah.
Holy.
So, there was still lots of deer in the 80s. Yeah.
Yeah.
I saw 84 deer that year, and I don't know, like I said, what it was. I'm sure maybe it was 50 and then 30 out this way, but I probably saw 50 up there. Saw 9 in one bunch, all does and lambs, 3 does with their lambs. They were all together. You don't see that anymore hardly. Sometimes you might see 2, but
That's crazy just to think back, and
yeah,
especially like for someone like you that's witnessed it from then to what it's like
yeah.
now. It's
I kind of started probably like when the end was getting near, for it. That's when I got going, because I can remember, going into places. It was like when I first started up here, it was like, I think back on it now and I go, boy, I should have been hunting here 20 years ago, but it didn't matter. 20 years, before then, you could go about anywhere and it was be just as good,
yeah.
But yeah, it was crazy. We saw it going downhill, but like if we had the first week we ever went up there, we had Chris was with us, Chris and his buddy Marcus.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then there was 2 other guys from Rhode Island, a father and son, and a guy from Plymouth, Mass, Old George. There was 5. We had 5 hunters. We come up there, and I'd scouted around, and my other guy at the time, his name was Fred, and we'd come up and scouted and stuff. But I remember going up there. I mean, you could bump into deer pretty easily up there. But imagine and back then we didn't really take the guys like right with us. We kind of like sent them off or we built blinds and put them in it. Well, them 3 guys, and Chris only stayed half the week. I remember I had to take him back out on Wednesday evening. They shot 3 big bucks, and the other guy should have shot one too, but he didn't quite get his chance, I guess. But yeah, 3 good ones, 2 10s and a 7, and it didn't seem like anything out of the ordinary at the time. Now if you did that, you'd be like bragging everywhere about it.
You're a living legend
Had
for the
4
season.
guys and shot 3 bucks, or whatever. Yeah. But anyways, we we've seen a lot of changes, but we have to adapt to it,
Vicious cycle. Everything's changing constantly.
Yeah, it is. There's places now that we've been controlling the coyotes, there's a lot of the places I go look at, and I'm like, it's for me reminiscent. It's like back in the old days, kind of. Some of the places, not everywhere, of course, but yeah, them deer they're survivors,
What about talk a little bit about moose hunts? I know you shared some stories with me
Oh,
about
geez.
back in the day.
Yeah. I had counted up the time I sold my place in 2013. I started guiding moose hunters in 1992 because we moved up in the fall of 91 and we took 3 hunters. That's what I booked. Back then there was 1,000 permits, and they were all, back then it was when they went to those central zone, northwest, northeast. There was 7 zones, and we were in the southwest zone. Zone 8 was the southwest zone, and there was only one season back then.
The September season, or
Nope.
October?
It was actually in between when it is now. It was the first full week of October.
Okay.
So it might start the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, something. It just rotated in that first full week. First year we had 3 hunters. I had that Fred I was talking about was guiding, and then Steve Coleman. He was a forest of, at the time, it was started out over here with Scott Paper, and then he went to Landvest, and he died tragically too, but that's a story for another day. But anyway, the 3 of us, we had our hunters, and we struck off in the morning. We were going out kind of where the clear cuts were. That's all anybody knew to do. We all had picked out clear cuts. We were going to go look, and that's where we were going to hunt. And Steve had these great radios at the time. They were ICOM radios, and he was a communications guy. You could talk for miles on them things. They were like 10-watt radios or something. He had a base station in his house. He had it in his truck. Talk anywhere. First thing in the morning, we get a call. Fred's guys got one down right at daylight. They walked into that cut, and it was a nice bull, and they shot it. We went over, and Steve had a chainsaw winch. First time I saw one. We chainsaw winched it out, got it loaded in the truck, and away goes Fred. We split up, headed out, and we ended up each shooting our moose like about 10 o'clock. Neither one of us knew it. And I'd put the radio on the dashboard of the truck because we'd been talking, and I just never thought about it. And back then, you had to go to Greenville to tag them. Yeah, you had to go to a Fish and Wildlife headquarters, so we got to go to Greenville. We head over to Greenville, get over there, and the line is like 50 cars deep, trucks deep, because everybody shot moose on the first day back then.
Yeah.
From the road. Nobody went in the woods. So anyways, I couldn't even pull in. The Fish and Wildlife place over there's got a long driveway. I don't know if you've been there. It goes down in and it goes around. I mean, they were tagging them there. And then there was a place from southern Maine that had a refrigerated truck. People wanted them cut up. They put them right in there. They made a killing, But anyway, I'm not even off the main road. We're out on the main road. Can't even turn down. I told my guys, it's a father and son. I said, this is going to be a long night. So we finally got turned in, and we're down, we're making time. So you only move one vehicle length about every 15 minutes because that's how long, they was dissecting them moose at the time, right? Anyway, we get down there, and all of a sudden I hear, hey, Dad, you on there? And I'm like, it's the radio on the dash. And it's Steve's. And then Steve comes on and said, yeah, Tenny, right here. He goes, where are you? And he goes, I'm at the tagging station in Greenville. Well, he was there too, and we didn't even know it. And he was like 10 cars in front of me, 10 vehicles. So it was his son Tenny calling from the base station. That's how good his communication was.
Holy,
Up on the hill in Jackman to Greenville on a handheld radio.
that's crazy.
Well, he had the base station. It had a big whip antenna, but we had these
Yeah.
and could talk back home. So, anyways, I walked down and I told Steve, I'm right behind you. Where are you? And he goes, oh, I'm about 20 cars from being down there. And I said, well, I'm behind you. So we compared moose, and stuff. But that's how it was. But the moose was so thick back then. I mean, we didn't know. We just thought that was normal, not knowing that like up your way at the time, there wasn't many moose. Because my father got drawn the first full season in 82, and we went up to zone 1, northwest zone. It was 75 permits, and I think the last 75 people drawn all got that zone. Nobody wanted to go there. It was so far,
Yeah.
And there wasn't very many moose. I looked and I made one of them can calls, and we walked in the woods, me and my father, quite a bit. It was hot that was a year they did something stupid. They closed the bear season a week early and put the moose season the third week of September like that.
Really?
It was like 90 degrees half the week. We ended up finally, we saw a cow and a calf, I think on Wednesday, and then Wednesday night it poured and it changed, but we ended up shooting a spike bull the next morning so we could get out of there. And we was glad to get any moose because you could shoot either sex back then, but then the moose got wild around here, and from then on, I mean, nobody knew how to market moose hunters. They just figured their regular ads would, and it was quite a while. We had probably, I don't know, it might have been 7 or 8 years into it, but I booked all the hunters I had for guides. I'd see who wanted to guide. There was some locals that would guide. So I usually took about, I don't know, 6 or 8 moose hunters, and all in the zone, We'd shoot them all the first day usually. If we didn't, we might go another day or two if it was something wrong. But you've seen the picture I showed you.
That's what I was just gonna say. That's the one that stands out the most to me is that game pole. And I don't think there's one there under 45 inches, was there?
I think they were all over 50.
I mean, that's a game pole full, and there was snow on the ground too.
Yeah, we had snow 2 years in a row. We had snow that year, and I mean, I don't mean a little bit of snow. I mean, we got 8, 10, 12 inches of snow in places, and that year I think it started snowing the first morning, because then we got them home and put them on the game pole, and you see they had snow on them. Yeah, there was 5 50-inch bulls and a cow.
Yeah, there was one
cow. The husband
there.
And wife. She got a cow and he got a bull. They got them in the same cut. There was like 10, 12 moose in the cut.
This is all
picked out the biggest bull and the biggest cow and shot them.
This is all just driving down the road style hunting too.
No. We didn't drive the roads. We went in the cuts. We went in the hidden cuts.
Yeah, but
we didn't call. You didn't really have to call.
Yeah,
because there was, when they opened up them, there was still opening up a lot of areas that hadn't been cut since the 60s. And as soon as you made a clear cut, that was like planting an alfalfa field or something.
They come running.
I saw, the most I ever saw in one cut one morning was 17 moose in one cut. It was a big cut, and it rolled up over some hills.
That's a lot of moose, though.
Yes, it was 17. I mean, it tells you how stupid it was. There was too many,
Yeah.
Yeah.
You don't see that nowadays.
No.
But it's funny, though, like how you talk about the moose always used to be down here and not up north. And, like, the same with a deer. And it's almost like everything is flip-flop. There's more deer down here now than there is up north.
Yeah.
And there's more moose up now than there is down here. It's like everything's
because
flip-flopped.
The cutting practices here favored the moose in the beginning, most places. And it wasn't that there was moose everywhere. It was mostly on the Scott paper lands. Because they were doing massive clear cutting before they were up north.
Mm-hmm.
The area into the west here, they never clear cut. So that never had a lot of moose. Well, when I told you about we went up when we went up Addian and when we were deer hunting up there, that hadn't been opened up at all. That hadn't been cut since the 60s. And there was no moose up there.
Really?
We deer hunt. If you saw a moose track, it was like a conversation at supper at night up there. If somebody saw a moose track. Yeah, there was no moose.
Really?
And then when they started opening up, then you started seeing a few and a few more. And it got pretty thick with them up there too, but you could never hunt them because it's all gated, you know. And then they had to die off too. They got so many, then they got the ticks and died off. You go up there now, there's some moose up there, but not any more than anywhere else. But so I think we ended up killing. I had counted it up before we left there. We'd killed 200 moose.
200 moose?
Yeah, between 1992 and 2013, we killed 200 moose.
Holy cow. That's crazy.
Yeah, and a lot of big ones. Yeah.
Over your years of guiding and being in the business, what's the most drastic change that you've seen? Like whether it's technology, animals, like
well, the moose herd dying off with the ticks was drastic. It could have been prevented if they'd have managed it right, but that was a drastic change, which it actually was. It was, in the long run, I think it was a change for the good because it made people have to hunt more for moose, you know. It made it a hunt instead of just a road sideshow, you know.
grocery shopping.
Yeah. And at the same time, you know, cutting all the deer yards was a drastic thing I've seen over the years. You know, losing the deer herd, a lot of it, knocking it way down. Technology, you know, it's funny that it's kind of a double-edged sword. You know, GPS, when that came out, it was great, you know, but what it did was it made people, I don't want to say lazy hunters, but it made them not hunt as much, you know. They thought that was the answer. They could do anything with their electronics instead of just focusing on,
Relying.
you know, yeah, they relied on it too much. Still do. That's why they still don't get. They all got GPS, but they still don't. They don't go in the woods much because they're afraid to. Because the GPS just doesn't tell them much, you know. So, I mean, the GPS tells them something, but it doesn't. They're still scared if that thing broke, they wouldn't get out of the
Oh, if
woods.
the batteries died or something like that, they'd be lost.
Yeah.
And no one sits down and looks at a topo map anymore to like see the terrain and that stuff, you know, as a backup. Like everyone,
No.
I mean, Onyx. Everyone uses Onyx now and your GPSs and all that stuff.
Nobody knows how to use a map because when I do my deer clinics, I'm doing them this time of year, and the only ones that know really now anything about map and compass really is if somebody's got a guide's license recently. You know, they went through it, and the military guys, they know some, but really it's not. It's part of what some of the military training, but so most people do not know. The only thing they know about a compass, it points north.
It points north.
That's about it, really, because they rely. I think they don't think they need it. They rely on their electronics and stuff. So, but anyway, yeah. But I kind of embrace a little bit of it because for me, as you get older and you know, gets a little harder to log on, you know, as many miles without taking a rest. You know, if you can have your truck marked in, if you're in an unfamiliar spot or whatever, you can save some steps getting out later. We used to have to just say, well, I can get out to that road there and then I can walk 5 miles down the road. I mean, that's what we did for years and years, just get out of the woodsy end of the day and walk the road in the dark, you know. Yeah.
Yeah. Makes it a little bit easier to navigate around and that stuff.
Yeah. It does make it easier, but I tell people don't rely on electronic equipment, you know.
Well, I mean, that's one of the first things they used to teach you in the guide school. Like, if you mention anything during your test about using a GPS or anything battery operated, they'd fail you. And
Yeah.
now
Now you have
owning
to do it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
now you got to know how to operate a GPS in order to get your guide's license.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you something. This just happened last weekend in my clinic, and it's related to electronic equipment. I had a father and son come over from upstate New York for the clinic, and I always picked the best day to go in the woods, which was going to be Saturday. So Friday we did map and compass, classroom stuff, and then we get up that night. I went to bed and I can hear my door opens, and I hear I'm dead asleep. I just fell asleep, so I'm in that dead, and I hear my name, and I'm like, Hal, you awake? Oh, he goes, did I wake you up? And I go, yep. And he's looking, he says, you got any copper? And I go, copper? He said, my son's insulin injector is broke, insulin pump. And I go, the only thing I can think of is he needs copper wire or something. I said, take one of them extension cords. If you got to cut it apart and get a piece of wire out of it, go ahead and do it. I said, you need any help? And he goes, no, I can get it. Well, ended up, they couldn't. It was something in where you put the battery in there or something. He tried to fix it with tinfoil first, he said, but he never cut the cord because he said he realized he couldn't fix it. So in the morning, it was breakfast time, and they said, we're going to have to head out. The kid couldn't eat breakfast. We're having French toast and bacon. He said, I can eat some bacon. He did not even have that electric pump was his lifeline. It tells you what your sugar is, and then it injects it into you, the insulin. I said, don't you have a finger prick thing and a tester? And he goes, yeah, I do, but I didn't bring it. It's the same idea.
Oh, it is. You rely too much.
Electronic, and that's like a life-threatening thing. So they had to jump. He said, we got to get home because he had no way to know what his sugar is or how much insulin he might need. Ruined his trip. They missed the day in the woods, and they had to drive back, Yes. So, yeah, don't rely on your electronics. They're handy tools, but don't trust your life to none of that electronic stuff. Well, unless maybe you got a pacemaker or something. I guess you probably ought to trust that.
I don't think you don't carry no spares for them with you.
No.
Well, anything else you'd like to say? Any stories or anything? Are you done? You good?
Well, we could talk all day if you
I
wanted
know,
to.
but like
How much are we into this thing?
over an hour, ain't it? Yeah, I think we can wrap it up if you want.
Yeah.
Unless you want to talk some more.
I got to save myself. I might have to talk about something else today.
All right. Well, thanks for listening to another episode of Through the Eyes of a Maine Guide. And thank you, Hal, for being on and sharing.
Hey, my pleasure. Yeah, we gotta keep it alive. If the old guides tell the stories, then you guys can keep passing them on.
That's right.
I remember when Hal told me.
That's the whole reason behind
right.
behind doing what we're doing.
Yeah.
So if you liked what you see, make sure you hit subscribe and like and follow us along for more to come.